All right, so how do we study autobiographical memory? Well, one way is to use a strategy called targeted event recall. In this strategy, you ask the participant to recall, I call them an S apostrophe S, that's short for subjects. So recall a specific documented event from the subject's past. So it's a documented event. This is tricky, right? Because how many things in your life are documented where we could confirm that it happened or it didn't happen, or we have details about exactly what happened, right? Like that's going to be a little self-limiting having that part of it. It needs to be documented. But we need to know that it happened so that we can look at how the person's recall style progresses. Do you do a forward style where you begin at the event, and then the story that the person tells sort of ends with the most recent thing? Probably the present is where they'll be done. Or do they do a more backward approach where they sort of start from their perspective where they are right now, and then they're sort of retrieving details of these different events, and they're sort of isolated, not a coherent story working forward, but just sort of from their perspective now pulling back details that they think might be relevant and they aren't necessarily coherent. This allows us to assess how far away the event seems. A person who begins at the event and ends in the present probably perceives the event to seem closer than a person who's looking at it in that backward way where they're just pulling isolated details. Imagine if you were talking to someone and you go, "Oh, you want to hear about my first day of kindergarten? Okay, let me tell that story as if it's happening, like live, and I will end with today." So I went to my first day of kindergarten and I was really nervous. And I remember the teacher writing my name on a name tag and putting it on my shirt. And some of the other kids were crying, but I didn't understand why because I was really excited to be there. And then I went inside the room and then like step by step like that. That's a forward approach. And typically a person tells that story if it feels to them like that event is close in time. Something that seems farther away for them, so like maybe how you might describe your first day at kindergarten, they might say something like, well, I do remember going, my mom walking with me to school. I remember that. And then maybe a little bit later you'd recall, I do remember the teacher writing my name on a sticker. Like I'd never had a sticker with my name on my chest before, so I thought that was pretty cool. You like these isolated kinds of little bits and pieces that would indicate that the memory seems a little farther away. So that's what we call targeted event recall. And I used first day of kindergarten because we all know that everybody, I can't say everybody, not all people go to kindergarten, but we could document that really easily, whether this particular subject went to kindergarten. And we could even, some researchers in this kind of area of autobiographical memory will actually reach out to family members to get details. Can you tell me when your child's first day of kindergarten was? Can you tell me details that you recall from the adult perspective? Like these kinds of things, so that when the participant or the subject is relating their stories, then we have sort of like this baseline. The other thing that targeted event recall can clarify for us is whether the person is giving us more of a memory or giving us more of an autobiographical fact. So, if they say something like, yeah, I went to kindergarten and that was my first day of school. Like that feels a lot more like a fact than if they say, oh, I was very nervous. I remember walking holding my mom's hand, and like that kind of detail kind of implies that it's still a memory for them rather than a fact. Diaries would be another way to get at autobiographical memory. Sometimes people keep diaries over time, or journals, however you want to call it, where they sort of write stuff in there. For people who keep diaries, they can be recruited into these kinds of studies and they'll be asked, can you let us look at your diaries? And then we'll use the contents of the diaries to ask the person to tell us more about some event that's documented in the diary. It allows us to look at things that you probably couldn't look at in a targeted event recall. I mean, targeted event recall, we're going to be limited to things that we could objectively document. Whereas with the diary approach, if it's in the diary, then it's fair game for asking more questions. And so we can ask about more kinds of memories using the diary approach. The keyword approach, you use a keyword as a prompt to elicit autobiographical memories. And it using this technique where we give you some kind of keyword has given us something called the autobiographical memory function. Function is a term that's used to describe a graph. So Usher and Neisser in 1993 produced this graph, this autobiographical function, it's called autobiographical memory function. And what you see is this really interesting curvilinear pattern where very few memories are recalled early from the earliest part of a person's life. So this is, we're going to be asking people to look back on their memories. So we're not asking 0 to 5-year-olds to tell us about things. We're asking, probably 20-year-olds to look back on their childhood. And you see very few things recalled from the 0 to about 5-year period. You see a relatively lot, like very rich period between the ages of 10 and about 25. And then you see sort of a drop between 30 and about 35, and then you start to see good recall for the recent years, for older people looking back, 40, 45, 50, we're seeing higher memory rates than we were seeing at 30 and 35. So this is called the autobiographical memory function, and I'm going to talk about the parts of that as we go on, but I just want to kind of just give you the overview of what the function looks like. So using the keyword technique, we can ask people, probe them with a particular cue, like being admitted to the hospital or something like that. And then tell me anything, were you ever, if you say yes, then tell me anything you can remember about it, that kind of thing. So here are some keywords and times that they were recalled to have happened, and then how many memories the person recalled. And so first off, if something happened around age 1 that was going to the hospital, a death in the family, or having to move, I think we can see there that people who are age 1 when that happened do not remember much about any of those 3 things. But notice the blue line, sibling birth. Even if you were 1 year old and your sibling was born, there's a subset of people who do remember that happening, even though they were only a year old when it happened. So that's kind of impressive. The adding of a sibling seems to be meaningful enough that even a 1-year-old having that happen to them later on, now they can look back and they remember that arrival of their sibling. So as we go on, one thing you'll notice just overarchingly across the graph is the older the person was when the event occurred, the more likely they are to remember it. It's not perfect. It looks like, you remember a little bit more at age 2 than you do at age 3 on that, move thing, and it's kind of up and down, but the overall trend is up to the right. So as the older the person was when the thing happened to them, the more likely they were to recall the thing later. Being admitted to the hospital seems like a bit of an anomaly, because if you were 2 years old when you were admitted to the hospital or you were 4 years old, you seem to remember it better than if you were 3 or you were 5. So that's it feels a little bit like an anomaly. Being admitted to the hospital seems kind of memorable, is what I would argue. The birth of a sibling seems pretty memorable. And as you get older, a death in the family or a move gets more and more memorable. So the older you are when these things happen, the more likely you are to recall them. We have really focused in on the fact that little kids ages, 4 or under don't remember much. These are pretty dramatic things that are happening in this depiction, right? A sibling being born, a death in the family, being admitted to the hospital, moving. These are big dramatic things in a child's life. Not all children have these things happen to them, right? There are a lot of kids who, I'm thinking of my own self real quick. By the age of 5, for me, none of those things had happened by the age of 5. I had my first move when I was 6. I was the youngest sibling. I was never admitted to the hospital. And a death in the family didn't occur until I was like 14 that I'm aware of. Like if anybody died, no one told me. I don't know. I don't think. Well, I think some people must have died because I think I was alive when Aunt May died, but I didn't know who Aunt May was. Right? So for me, none of these things happened that I'm aware of in these age brackets. So imagine less dramatic things. I probably have some memory of certain things, but a lot of us have very shaky memories for our early childhood because not, it seems like something needs to be pretty dramatic for us to remember it. Let's just put it that way. It needs to be pretty dramatic for us as adults to be able to remember something that happened when we were less than 5 years old. Really common. Now, one of the things that we see, and you could probably can completely relate to this, is that when the family tells the story a lot, and especially if that story is accompanied with a picture, it makes the memory seem more like the child remembers it, even though they don't really remember it. They've just sort of incorporated the stories in the picture and they start to feel like they remember it. And this relates to like that Lost in the Mall example, right? Where if everybody else is talking about it, and particularly if they've shown us a picture where that's us doing the thing that the story is about, you start to get this weird sense of, am I remembering this or am I just remembering that you guys tell this story a lot? I don't know if this is an actual memory or not. So it's probably, the these examples of sibling birth, a death in the family, admission to a hospital, or a move, if those memories are accompanied with family stories and pictures, they are much more likely to be retrieved as in adulthood than if the family hasn't been talking about those things or there weren't pictures. So keep that stuff in mind. Also, it might be, autobiographical facts, like things that happen when we're really, really little. They start to become facts for us, and this is where things can be kind of weird and risky in families because families will tell stories starring us as 1, 2, 3-year-old children that start for us to become facts about ourselves when the truth is it's our family members' interpretation of maybe an isolated incident that they thought was funny, cute, embarrassing, something like that. And we'll internalize it as a fact about ourselves. And we'll think that it's part of our identity. And we think it's like meaningful. But it might just be something that is more telling about what our family thinks is cute or endearing or whatever, and less about our own selves. So it's one of those things about memory. We internalize it, it becomes part of our identity, and it may not really even be that meaningful, but it becomes a fact for us. And we go, well, I guess I was just bossy, right? Um, it's kind of an interesting little weird thing about how kid memories work and then how families will sort of solidify things and not realizing that this is forming the child's identity. If the thing happens when we're ages 4 or 5, it's more likely we might actually independently remember that thing. Looking back on it as an adult, we may actually remember that event ourselves. It's not just because family stories and pictures made it become a fact. So we might have the sense of an autobiographical memory if the thing happened when we were ages 4 or 5. All right. So the emergence of autobiographical memory. I'm shortening it to AM because I'm sorry, that is too long of a title. So, autobiographical memory parallels language development. This is really super important. The way that our parent or parents narrate things for us from very early on. We're talking about memories that may have been formed long before we might have gone to preschool or daycare or kindergarten, where predominantly our parents are helping us to interpret the world around us, right? They find that in research that parents tend to be more elaborative in their narrative style when they are talking to their daughters. They ask questions, they give more details when talking to daughters. They did a study where parents were just they were at like basically the Pacific Science Center type of place near a university. I can't remember where the university was now, but it was every big city has that kind of place, right? And so the parents were going through the displays and doing these things, and the researchers were just observing how the parents talked to their daughters and how they talked to their sons. And they found that they gave the daughters much more elaborated explanations of what was going on. They attracted their attention to details about the displays. Whereas with the boys, they were much more pragmatic in their conversations. They told them how to turn the knob and make the thing work, or what to pull on, or where what hole to look through, or very much more directive, and how to do it. Whereas with daughters, they were much more likely to explain and ask the daughters questions. What do you think about this? Oh, do you think that's pretty? These kinds of things. Where sons, they were like, oh, pull on the pulley. Yeah, look, is it lighter now? Yeah, it is. And it's not a lot of explanation, because a pulley helps take some of the weight off. It just basically pragmatic. Look what a pulley can do. Pulley makes it lighter. That's it. And not a lot of explanation like they were giving to the daughters. On average, females tend to have better autobiographical memory than males do. Males will oftentimes give that excuse, oh, I don't have a very good memory for details. They'll oftentimes just let it go, whereas females tend to remember a lot of details about their own life. They then start to become the memory keeper. If they have a male romantic partner, they start to become the memory keeper for the couple. They are typically the ones who are the memory keeper for the children, and they are the ones who teach predominantly their daughters how to think about things in a way that will help to make things more memorable. And so there are maybe predispositions that females have and how their brains work and things like that that might make them just naturally better at autobiographical memory storage. But there are also social factors that can contribute to females developing better autobiographical memory skills. As our frontal lobe develops, so does our autobiographical memory store. So language development, which the production of language is completely housed in the frontal lobe. The ability to hear and understand language, that happens in our temporal lobe, but our ability to actually respond happens in the frontal lobe. So it's not surprising that as language develops, it contributes to the formation of autobiographical memory, and it also contributes to our expression of our autobiographical memory. Without language, how else are you going to describe your autobiographical memories? Right? Without some language capability, how are you going to indicate whether something happened to you or not, how things felt, or what you were thinking, or those kinds of things? It's completely dependent on language. And so as the frontal lobe develops, so does autobiographical memory, and it might be that language development really is that mediating factor that makes it possible. Now, because the frontal lobe is the last part of our brain to develop, and our sense of self is housed in that frontal lobe predominantly, we shouldn't be super surprised to find out that autobiographical memory really develops after our sense of self. And really, if you don't have a sense of self, how would you have an autobiographical memory anyway? Right? You have to feel like an autonomous person moving through the world separate from the other people for you to start to say, these memories are mine. These are memories of things that happened to me. Right? Who's me? I have a 1.5-year-old granddaughter who just recently recognized herself in the mirror for the first time. Very common to be 15 to 21 months old when you first recognize that's me in the mirror. That's the beginning. She has now got a sense of self. We now know that she realizes that that's her reflected in that mirror. And how do you know that? We put a little bit of lipstick on the tip of her nose, put her in front of the mirror, and instead of laughing at the baby in the mirror, she touched her own nose. So she knows that's her. She's probably now at 1.5 starting to do the kinds of thinking and processing that can lead to the development of autobiographical memories. Now, in individualistic cultures, we really emphasize personal autonomy and put a big emphasis on the self in individualistic cultures. And so we encourage babies to think about themselves and the world with relationship to themselves. In collectivistic cultures, social relationships are emphasized. And so it's not as much about the individual, but more about the interrelationship between members of the group and stuff like that. And so it's possible that that can have an impact on the development of the autobiographical memory system. So in the United States, here's an example of something that a preschooler said. An adult said about being in preschool. I remember being in preschool, learning to tie my shoes on my own and playing with all those skills games with shapes and eye-hand coordination. I got a gold star and realized my friend didn't. So myself was all I could appreciate for doing something on my own. Now here's a person in Taiwan remembering back on their childhood. Ever since I was little, my relatives would compare me with my girl cousin. Everyone said that I was the more sensible one. My girl cousin and I were 4 months apart in age. Perhaps because Perhaps it's because of the influence of the environment, especially my mom. So you notice, yes, they both kind of talked about other people, right? In the United States, the person was like, I realized that I got a gold star, my friend didn't. So I could only appreciate my success on my own kind of thing. But that wasn't quite the interrelationship story that we saw in the Taiwanese example, right? Where I was always being compared to my girl cousin. There was this interrelationship going on. And so the autobiographical memory in Taiwan is much more interrelated, more collectivistic, and the one from the United States is much more personal autonomy. Look, I got a gold star and I was learning to tie my shoes and I must have done a good job at it and like that. So while both of these are a little bit vague stories and you're not sure exactly what they're talking about, you can kind of see the flavor difference between what was valued in the individualistic culture and what was valued in the collectivistic culture, with the United States being an example of an individualistic culture and Taiwan being an example of a collectivistic culture. All right. So I think this is the last thing I'm going to say about the emergence of autobiographical memory. The more maternal elaboration, so it looks like the way that mom talks about things is more important than how dad talks about things in the research. And so the more mom elaborates, the more things that mom says to encourage the child's attention on what is happening at the time while this autobiographical memory is being formed. So the more mom elaborates, the earlier the age of earliest memory. So the younger the person is in their earliest memory. So when you have a mom that does a lot of elaborations, the association is that you'll have a child who is younger when they start forming autobiographical memories. So I guess the takeaway here is whether you have male or female children, don't only elaborate for the females, right? But whether you have male or female children, lots of elaborations, helping them to think about what's going on right now. How are you feeling about this? What do you think about that? These kinds of things. Oh, do you like this? Is this fun? I remember when my son was little, he was like stoic all the time. Like flat affect, we call it in psychology, where the person doesn't show like a bunch of excitement, stuff like that. And so we had to tell him, if you're having fun, say we, right? Because we couldn't even tell if the kid was enjoying stuff. He was not big on elaborating, and we would try and get him to elaborate, but we couldn't figure out, how to get. It was very difficult, right? But what the good news is both my husband and I are big elaborators, and even though he wasn't being very expressive as a toddler, he seems to remember a lot of those things. So I would say it's worth it, even if at the moment it doesn't seem like the child is internalizing those elaborations or benefiting from them in some way. I think it's worth your while because I think it makes things more memorable for the child. All right, let's go ahead and stop here and we'll come back and talk about some aspects about the autobiographical memory function that I showed you before.